recording to the cloud. And I think we'll get started. So again, welcome to all of you. I'm really glad to have you all here. I'm excited to be talking today to Mike Crimmins. My name is Eli Sagor. I'm an extension specialist at the University of Minnesota. I do forestry work. I'll introduce Mike, or have him introduce himself in a couple of minutes. But before we jump in, I want to do a couple of things. One is I want to acknowledge our sponsor, I don't know, NREF, the Natural Resources Extension Education Foundation. NREF is the organization that organized this series of, I guess this is a webinar, and we are happy to be here. I'm on the board of trustees of NREF. It's just a wonderful organization dedicated to building a legacy and a strong financial foundation for extension and natural resources work in close partnership with ANREP, the Association of Natural Resources Extension Professionals. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that NREF is in the midst of a fundraising campaign. The 2021, $20.21 for 2021 campaign. If you're inclined, we'd sure appreciate having you make a small donation at nref.org. If not, just enjoy the conversation. Again, Eli Sagor with the University of Minnesota, based in Cloquet. I have a little bit of experience with podcasting. For about a year, I hosted the Camp 8 podcast with my friend and coworker, Kyle Gill. And I've got here with me Mike Crimmins, who you can see on your screen if you're watching the live or recorded video. Mike is an extension specialist in climate science at the University of Arizona. And Mike, I wasn't sure where you were based until I listened to the podcast, but it sounds like you're in Tucson. Is that right?
Yeah, we're in Tucson. That's right. Yeah.
Great. And you and Ben McMahon are two of the people, the two co-hosts, at least that I've heard on the podcast. Right. Who's the rest of your team?
Yeah. So we started this podcast. It was actually Zach Guido and I and Greg Carfin back in 2012. And it was in response to, we had a La Nina event emerge in 2011, and it was a pretty deep drought for the Southwest, and it reached over to Texas and the Great Plains. And that was kind of the beginning of the podcast right there in 2012, kind of in response to that event. Yeah.
So it's not just your hair, your podcast is long.
It's true.
It's getting longer in the tooth as well.
Yeah,
so you are really at the cutting edge. I mean, you maybe that's not the right way to say it. I don't know, but I think the earliest podcast that I'm aware of in extension, you're coming up on a decade of podcasting.
Yeah, it's funny. I still remember the very conversation we had back in 2011. So I started this job in 2005 when I got hired on here at U of A to be the extension specialist for climate. And I'm affiliated and a co-investigator with our NOAA RESA program. So it's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has a program through the Climate Program Office, and has these regional centers across the US called Regional Integrated Science and Assessments. And so they're interdisciplinary teams of social and physical scientists who work together on kind of local climate issues. And so ours is called Climate Assessment for the Southwest. And as a graduate student, I was working with that program, and then I got hired on an extension, and my position was written that I would be embedded with our NOAA RESA. So that was really cool. So it was an extension connection to the NOAA RESA. So I was involved right off the bat working with CLEMAS on something called the Southwest Climate Outlook. And it's a monthly publication where we, for the region, go through kind of all the recent conditions and impacts, and then look at the forecast outlook, and then try to put that all together in a really nice, concise monthly PDF. We used to mail it out back in the day.
Very detailed. The ones I saw, 7-8 pages, lots of charts, lots of detail.
Right. And we had a bit of research that found that, farmers, ranchers, resource managers, they really like this idea of not having to go to 10 websites, and then, or 20, or now 50, and then try to find all those nuanced things. And then we try to put it all together and do a little bit of interpretation and a little bit of education with that. So that's been kind of going. So I was one of the authors at the beginning. I wrote a couple of sections, and quite honestly, the podcast was born out of laziness, because I got to a point where I thought, man, wouldn't it be easier if we just talked about what we're seeing rather than writing it down? And so I remember that conversation in the hallway, and again, it was 2012. Podcasts, I think, had been out for a while.
Sure.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure I had listened to any podcasts at that point, but we gave it a shot. And so that was where Zach, who was working at Clemus at that point, and Greg was as well. We just sat down and actually kind of went through the Southwest Climate Outlook. And so it was more like an audio book than it was than a podcast at the beginning. And so we've kind of morphed it and continued with it, and over time. And honestly, it's one of the funnest things I do with my job, because you get to nerd out on this thing that I'm really passionate about, and we interact with a lot of some of our listeners over email and Twitter now too, which is fun.
Yeah, well, and we're going to talk about your monsoon fantasy in a little bit too, which I think is another really interesting way that you've taken the podcast platform and made it a little bit more engaging. But that's interesting you say that. On with my experience with podcasting, thinking about it at the end of our first year, and it's been on hiatus now for about a year. But that's what I enjoyed so much about it too. I always figured it was a dedicated hour or whatever. Ours were about an hour long, as yours are, where I'm just talking to this person and I get to pick who the people are. It's a little different from yours. We have guests on, and I get to call someone up who's really interesting, someone with good ideas and a lot to say, and talk to them in a focused way. You might have noticed I just took my phone and threw it across the room because I don't want the distraction in this conversation. And it's the same when we're recording those. And you and Ben really sound like you're having a beer and talking about, just like you say, nerding out on this stuff. And it really makes for an engaging kind of conversation. I mean, it's different from audience members being able to, raise their hand and ask a question in real time. But it's pretty fun to listen in on two interesting people having a conversation that they both know a lot about and are excited about. And is that, you mentioned going through the Southwest Climate Outlook and reviewing some of the high points of that written piece. Is that kind of what you do? Do you just kind of get together and have a conversation, or do you have other, how do you plan and approach developing an episode?
Yeah, it's the process it's kind of had a core element to it over the years, and then has I think evolved in, I think, a really positive way. So Ben McMahon, who's now with Clemus, he got hired on. Ben's been with us for quite a while now, and he's just good at all these sorts of things. He's an anthropologist by training, so he's got a PhD in anthropology, but he's got a background in like remote sensing and fire, and he's really good with code and that kind of stuff. But he also is a musician and knew a lot about recording.
Yeah.
So when he got hired on, Ben just really changed our game, because Zach and I didn't really know what we were doing on the recording, and we never edited anything.
Yeah.
So when Ben came on, Ben is actually a formal producer of the podcast now. And so we all had offices near each other kind of pre-pandemic. And so we'd always have these sort of kind of conversations in the hallway about, like, what would just happen, or did you read this new paper, or did you see that article in the newspaper about, this water issue and that kind of stuff. And so we'd make notes. And then another thing that had changed, this is probably 5 years ago, is that we started using Slack. And then it was just a constant Slack discussion.
Huh.
And so when we moved into when the pandemic shut us down, we didn't miss a beat, because we had these Slack conversations. We actually have Slack channels where each channel is a new month. And so like this morning, we were already prepping for our next discussion that's going to happen about 2 weeks from now. And then Ben and Zach and I now do everything remotely. So we've been actually recording the podcast over Zoom for, I think, the last 12, 13, 14 episodes, since at least March 2020. And it has worked really well. And from what Ben says too, from the process standpoint, the editing and stuff like that. So we, I think, really do sound a lot better than the raw conversation, because Ben does a lot of editing, and he will even, kind of like say, what, guys, there's a part of the podcast that it just kind of fell flat. So I took it out, and we're like, okay, that's great. Yeah. So I think it really cleaned it up. So we, that having that kind of support is great. But from the process standpoint, we have the Slack channel. We get together for about an hour ahead of time, and then we share screens, use Slack, and then come up with an outline. And then Zach likes to think about this kind of from a sports commentary, where he's kind of the main announcer. I'm the color commentary guy.
Yeah.
And he really does drive the stats and that kind of stuff. And I always like, well, did you know about blah, 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 and that kind of stuff. And then he'll bait me on discussions too.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Where he knows.
Yeah. Is this a generational monsoon? What do you think, Mike? Or is this just a big one?
He's so good at it. And so that dynamic is really helpful, because he's a little bit, he wants to push me a little bit. And I think if I did it by myself, it'd be a lot flatter. So we've got a kind of a good rapport, and I'm really thankful for that kind of this team effort we got going on.
Well, that's cool. I know we're going to have questions, and I've just shared in the chat a link that folks can use. It was in the email I sent earlier as well, but a link folks can use to post questions. And I know we're going to have questions and a lot of interest in kind of how do you produce it, and we can talk about that a little bit later too. But one of the things that I was struck by as I was listening to you and Ben in the most recent episode, I teach a class on science communications at the University of Minnesota, and we have a resource that I linked to with a fellow named Todd Rubold. Todd is with the university's Institute on the Environment, and he has this idea that when you're making a presentation, you should be yourself, only a little bit more interesting. And, I like, he talks about being a performer and, ratchet up the energy a little bit, and, don't try to be someone you're not, but try to be yourself, but a little more interesting. I think that's really a good way to put it. And you're a pretty high energy person. I don't know Ben at all, but it's clear from listening to the conversations that comes naturally to him. I mean, he almost sounds like, it's funny, you call him a sports commentator. He's just, both of you are interesting people to listen to. And it sounds like you're doing that. It sounds like you're bringing bringing the energy. Is that something you do intentionally, Mike, or does it just flow when the two of you start talking?
Yeah. So so Zach, you have pegged, because he's just has a fun personality, and I like to think I have a fun personality too. And I think that we just love talking about it, right? So it is not I think that we do try to make each other laugh, and we do try to kind of rag on each other in the podcast, which is really fun. And I've done podcasts with other people, like other types of podcasts. Like, this is really fun, having this kind of conversation with you. But I've done ones that are flat, that they're careful, they're scripted and that kind of stuff. And they are what they are at that point. So this is easy because, especially among the three of us. So, Zach and I are talking, and then Ben is listening in the background. He's producing it. And so he'll Slack us or chat us. And sometimes he'll even break the third wall and come in and they'll be like, guys, that's not right. He'll correct us, which I think is awesome too. And it just makes it kind of a fun atmosphere. And we, we're passionate about it, because we love thinking about what's happening down here. And we love connecting with people that are also really passionate about it. And, in extension too, working in ag and natural resources, that's our people right there. These are people who are out working in the weather and climate and are intimately linked with it. So we're always sensitive to that. We're not making light of things that shouldn't be made light of, and that need to be, taken seriously. Droughts are impactful and those kinds of things, but we really celebrate the rains and really celebrate them in a meaningful way, when they do come, because we know that a lot of people are sort of connected to that. So it comes easy, and it doesn't have to be too much performance. But we do know that a little bit of preparation, having some of our facts straight, and then just bringing that energy. And we'll even know when we're kind of off in a particular podcast too, because one will have to kind of pull the other along as well.
I think that's really important. One of the things that I keep in mind a lot is just how fickle listeners are, how much competition there is out there. And when you fall flat, I tend to listen to podcasts either while I'm driving or while I'm running. That's just my routine.
Me too. Yep.
And and if it gets boring, if it gets stale, if the voices kind of start to trail off, and you can tell they're kind of looking at their notes and thinking about what they're going to do next, boy, it's easy to just flip to the next, whatever, some giant professional media organization has produced, that we're trying to compete with. And And, you
Yeah.
know, we sometimes in extension work so hard to get things technically accurate and to parse our words, like you're saying, and to script and make sure we don't step outside the lines. And that's important. There are reasons for that. And on the other hand, we can't do that at the expense of making it interesting.
Yeah.
And I think we're good at thinking that way too. But I do find that it's really important to focus on bringing the energy, to think of yourself a little bit more as an entertainer, or at least as much as an entertainer as you know, as you can, without, you know, sacrificing the you know, professionalism or anything else. It is a fickle medium.
Totally agree. Yeah, I've been struggling with this concept of, and I think it's a real thing, infotainment.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, it's like, okay, so what is Extension's role in this? And you know, I've done just a ton of media interactions over the last couple of months because we had a really epic
Yeah.
monsoon season down here, and sometimes, you know, it felt like I was just being used as content for their infotainment, you know, and I
Yeah.
was like, wait a minute, you're making all the money on this. And so I don't have any problem with us sort of having our own thing. And it absolutely is grounded in information and education. And hopefully it is entertaining at the same time, you know, that we are engaging people and that they are going, oh, that's interesting. I didn't really know that. And we've been trying to use it as like a real subtle, you know, push on climate change education as well. You know, we're
Yeah.
talking about weather and climate in the current context, but we're always trying to put it in the context of changes we're observing here too. So it's not, you know, maybe necessarily beat you over the head with it, but that it's engaging a lot of people. And I know that we've got a pretty diverse, you know, set of listeners across the Southwest from different backgrounds and maybe even, you know, the way they think about stuff because they've emailed us.
Yeah.
And so that hopefully we're still engaging them and keeping them interested and keeping them thinking about what we're saying. I mean, we're not always right. Oh my gosh, that's like the
Yeah.
running joke in our podcast is we're always trying to like use the climate outlooks and the climate forecast to tell people what's going to happen next season. And what a folly that is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, uncertainty is a big part of any scientific conversation, and especially in something like what you're doing, which is so easy to be proven wrong. It's
right.
it's
there's documentation of it, right?
Right. So Mike, you were just talking a little bit about engagement, and I brought this up a bit earlier. You know, with adult education, there are all kinds of principles that we try to build on. We want to engage learners where they are. We want to give them opportunities where we can to actively contribute to knowledge and content generation. We want to help them to, you know, we do needs assessment to make sure that we're delivering the right kind of information based on their feedback and their needs. I'm not going to ask you to talk about all of that. I think my impression with your podcast is that you had it grounded in this Southwest, the monthly thing, Southwest Climate Outlook. So you had a pretty good idea of the need and what you wanted to do there. But this engagement piece, I think, is really interesting. A lot of podcasts are, you know, they're one way, you know, you can't interrupt the show to ask a question, you know. But one thing that you've done is this monsoon fantasy game.
Right.
Seems like just a really interesting and creative and fun way to bring your audience in to, you know, to talk about this idea of uncertainty. Okay, you think you want to pick on me for being wrong? Well, you do better, you know.
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about that. How'd you start that, and how's it going?
Yeah. So, you know, again, you can probably guess that, you know, a monthly podcast through the year, we're sort of reflecting on what has happened and we're talking about what we think is going to happen. And again, it's grounded in this, we're using all this information from NOAA and all the other different agencies. And, you know, we're trying to interpret forecasts, we're trying to interpret maps, and we're just trying to understand what's happening across the region. And so, you know, we have this there's this pulse of the season down here where we have our summer monsoon season, you know, which starts in July and lasts through September. Really important for rain-fed agriculture, which is primarily grazing and livestock operations down here. Ends our fire season, you know, is an important sort of water source for ecosystems. So once you come up on that season, you're usually coming out of a winter. Could have been a good winter, often isn't down here in the Southwest. Spring is dry, so it's getting hot, it's getting dry out here. So our conversations in the spring turn towards excitement about what the upcoming season is going to look like, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to break the seasonal dry spell. It's pretty reliable. It shows up the end of June, beginning of July. So it's got this kind of like festival start feel to it. It's a really interesting phenomenon because it doesn't, it doesn't vary too much. It's a couple of weeks either side of a climatological start date. So Zach and I would always do this thing where we would we'd bait each other into saying, well, so what do you think the monsoon's going to be like? And be like, well, what do you mean? And like, well, how much is it going to rain for the whole season? And I would say this and he would say that, or, like, how much is it going to rain in the next month? We would do this throughout the year too. So be, like, okay, so what do you see coming? We do this in winter too with El Nino, La Nina, because that's a forecasting tool for us as well. So it's almost like taking those NOAA seasonal outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center and actually putting your money where your mouth is. We would bet each other beers and we would pay each other, we'd meet up, in kind of pre-COVID times and pay it up. But the monsoon thing evolved over a couple of years where we would bet each other how much it would rain in the next month through the monsoon season. And then we would talk about it and then goad each other, or gloat over each other.
Sure.
So we got 2 years ago, we decided, wouldn't it be fun if we could come up with a way of engaging anybody who cared, any of our listeners in the podcast with this too. So a year ago, we set up a really simple online Google form and had people just submit their guesses. And then we talked about them on the podcast and then, had a winner at the end. And I think it was really simple who got closest to the total at the end. And it turned out it was like one of our friends we had went to school with or something like that. So that was great. And so then it was really fun. And we decided, Zach really led this development this time. He actually got a little bit of money from an internal grant, engaged one of our IT teams here at U of A. And then we got a bunch of students. We had a student who is a stats undergrad in data science. And we got 2 computer science undergrads to help us develop this like sports betting online system where you create an account and based on a scoring system that's based on the historical climatology of 5 cities across the Southwest, you would pick your guess, based on the historical climatology, how much it was going to rain in July, August, and September. Yeah. And we ended up we learned a lot. The students did such a good job of thinking of a scoring system in this online platform. It was really cool. And then we rolled it out and then the media picked up on it. And so we had the media all across the Southwest go, this is so interesting. Then we ended up getting about 400 people that played.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really cool. And then it had an online leaderboard.
I was looking at the leaderboard. I think I saw 20 people and I thought, oh, well, look at that. They had 20 entrants and they're all in order. But and 380 more are not listed there. Wow, right, that's great.
Right. So it was really cool. And it turned out that some people got really, really into it. And we had a couple of like little bugs in the scoring and we got some like angry tweets at us about like and which helped us sort of like show that people were actually really engaged. And then the way that the monsoon turned out is that the season that we had opened up was July 1st through September 30th. Yeah. And it turned out that it rained on September 30th. So it was literally a buzzer beater. Yeah. Like, lob. And it changed up the top 10 score and somebody vaulted to the beginning. And it was really cool because the local newspaper wrote a story on it and interviewed the people that won. And it turned out that the woman who won is brand new. She works for University of Arizona. She just moved here from Michigan. Had never lived through a monsoon here. Yeah. And just like randomly put in a bunch of numbers. Yeah. so the take home was that, of all the forecasts and the season forecasters and everybody, the random guest won, and she won herself a weather station. So it was really fun.
Yeah, that's a great story. What a fun thing with the buzzer beater rainfall and this naive Michigander taking it all home. But I was impressed, and I think I saw that this year you're giving away 2 of those weather stations, and those are not it's not a rain gauge. I mean, those are what, $400 pretty nice weather stations.
And this was getting the grant from sort of the internal funding, liked our idea, and it was cool because the university got behind us too, and sort of saw it as an kind of a community engagement thing, as well as I think it helped sort of connect Extension in a kind of a unique way that we hadn't done before as well.
Yeah. That's great. So, Mike, let's go to a couple of nuts and bolts, and I'm
Sure.
seeing a couple of questions coming in about those topics. So first of all, can you share the logic model that you developed for your podcast?
I wish we had. You'd said that so seriously. Oh, yeah. Let me give me an hour.
Yeah.
I'll do it. And I'm not like logic models.
Yes,
they're so important, and I think they're really, really useful. And I'm not good at them, and I feel like a bad extension person for being so poor at logic models over the years. So, and I'm on a couple of projects right now where we're doing them right now.
Yeah, well, it would be heresy for us to be disparaging logic models. So any extension administrators out there, we support logic models. We are both on board.
Yes, I'm not. No, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's all good. Hopefully, we'll still be employed. But hey, so seriously, so not a logic model, but one of the things, and you and I have emailed about this, so I know roughly what you're going to say, but what I'm interested in is what were you hoping to achieve, or when you started out, and maybe you didn't have this all mapped out, but you must have had some idea of what success looked like, or you must have some idea of, okay, if this or that happens, maybe it's listener or download numbers, because I know data are really, really limited. That might lead us to, say, well, this was interesting, but it's not worth the trouble. Or maybe this other kind of really positive outcome, and maybe you had metrics in mind, would lead us to say, wow, we need to keep going, or we need to do more. Instead of monthly, let's make it biweekly. I mean, when you think about it, you've already said that part of it is that it's just fun, and it's a way to put out this really great, a different format of this Climate Outlook, monthly written newsletter. But how do you think about success with the podcast? Are there any metrics you're looking at? Is it number of angry tweets, which at least, like you said, help you know that someone's listening? How do you think about outcomes?
It's a really good question. And we've struggled with this within Clemis for a long time now too. Because Clemis is it's an organization founded on assessment and evaluation, right? And we have expertise within. And so we've talked about this a lot over the years. I think fundamentally the energy behind the podcast is it's Ben and Zach and I, and our love of doing it, right? So there's nobody's telling us we have to do it.
Yeah.
And there's no prescription for it. And we're not kind of bound to any sort of granting that says that we have to accomplish so many podcasts, over a period of time. So, and I think that having that low to no expectation at the beginning was really helpful, because we didn't have anything to lose, and we're pretty fearless about it over time. So, but over time, we, again, having no expectation, not even sure if anybody was listening to it, quite honestly, the cost was low. I mean, I've got my job and it's totally secured, and I count this as extension work, and it's the effort into it, at least on, time wise, is a couple hours a month. So it's pretty low. And I think, Ben has the most sort of vested interest because he's at Clemis, and his boss, our director, is all in on this because he sees it as really good for Clemis and us trying to innovate on this strategy and engagement. And I think, as you said, we were early on kind of doing this before other institutions before it was like, I don't even know, 10, 12 years ago, what kind of podcasts were out. We're probably not even as many media podcasts out there as well. But, we saw it as a way another mode to be able to push information out. So over time, we've done some evaluations. This is sort of broadly in CLEMIS, and have had good positive feedback that the podcast was helping with the mission of the Southwest Climate Outlook. And so that mission of the Southwest Climate Outlook was to get information out in a timely manner. It was relevant, and it was engaging, and it was supporting resource management and ag and natural resources. So we're accomplishing that. And then the podcast on top of that was helping with that strategy. And then over time, it was sort of soft and informal that we would go to meetings where people would engage with CLEMIS and go, hey, what you're doing is really good, and I really enjoy that. Or, a colleague would say, I caught that podcast and I have a question about this. So it would be more informal. And so we've talked about trying to more formally figure out who is listening. But it's like you said, that across the podcast platforms, it's really difficult to get sort of accurate downloads. And Ben, who was our producer, is very technical about this, and he's really struggled because we're across all these platforms now, and we're not totally sure. And then as we do surveys out through the CLEMIS network, they may cross, but they may not. We probably have a lot of listeners who are not sort of formally connected with like our CLEMIS newsletter and those kinds of things too. So it has been a struggle of sort of pulling those back and forth. The Monsoon Fantasy has been interesting because that's one way we've talked about it, but we've also had all this other media exposure. People were going right to the Monsoon Fantasy and not listening to podcasts because that wasn't their thing. Yeah. So, kind of a mess.
Well, it's interesting. And so for folks who are new to podcasting or thinking about podcasting, and Mike, you may know more, but I mean, you're hearing us talk about, Mike mentioned the number of downloads. So when we did it, we would publish our audio files on Amazon Web Services. That was the platform that the University of Minnesota provided for us. And from there, it would then propagate out to, Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and Spotify and whatever. And so that gave us the advantage. Then we'd get metrics from AWS. So we could see, regardless of what kind of device or platform they were pulling it from, we still had a pretty good idea of the number of downloads. But the number of downloads, hey, by the way, so for this event, the number of downloads would be like 80. We had 80 people register, Mike, for today. And what do we have? 30 online who made it. Well, just like that, 1,000 people, which we, to my amazement, hit that number a couple of times, downloaded it, but I don't listen to every podcast that I downloaded. Not everyone who registers for a webinar attends. And so, you get some numbers, but they're not the kinds of numbers that we'd want necessarily.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think that's something that we've still haven't solved too. And I think as the technology has changed as well. So we have some super fans that continue to engage us through email and through Twitter over time, and that kind of pulls us along. And in some of these, and the other interesting thing that has happened, and I mentioned this to you in the email when we were talking about this, is that we have found news articles that have quoted the podcast. Yeah. And so there have been, and I didn't know this happened, but there are quite a few reporters across the Southwest now who don't even talk to us.
Yeah.
They don't contact. They listen to the podcast and then they quote the podcast.
And that's huge. Hopefully they attribute it properly. Hopefully they mention you.
Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But it has been an interesting form of engagement that it kind of a force multiplier, as it goes outward. And then as I mentioned to you too, we'll have podcasts where then a reporter listens to the podcast and then follows up with you and said wants to learn more about what you're talking about, and then writes an article and then quotes you. So that's kind of cool. So it's almost like, maybe we're not getting 10,000 listeners. We're getting, a group of people that are really engaged and invested in what we're talking about. And it kind of comes and goes throughout the season, and that they sort of tune in because they want to get this information. Then maybe they sort of back off. And then maybe come in and engage with it again later.
Yeah, it's interesting. And some of those softer metrics, the kinds of things like the number of emails you get, the number of people who mention it at meetings. I mean, it's just gold when you get one of those emails or some person. I dropped I dropped something off at addressing and mailing on the U of M campus a few weeks ago, and the person there who, worked in addressing and mailing, wasn't in the forestry or natural resources community, said, "Oh, hey, I listened to your podcast."
That it's so cool.
What?
Yeah, I had this, the situation, exact same thing. I was at an extension event, middle of nowhere. It was kind of rural Arizona, and in this rancher, kind of fully decked out, comes up to me kind of real stoically, and he puts out his hand and he goes, "I love the podcast." And I was just like blown away, just blown away. And then over the years, I got to know him and talk with him more. And he's like, "Oh yeah, this is great, because it's the mode that I want, because I didn't want to paw through all these websites."
Yeah.
And I like the Southwest Comment, but I'd really like to hear you and Zach talk about, what you think about it. And I'm trying to get my other rancher friends to listen to it, but some of them aren't really into podcasts and, so on and so forth. So I'll tell them about what you guys talked about, as and it's
That's
the same
great.
thing of like, we get into drought situations where it is, a little bit more dicey, that we can really talk about what the forecast looks like coming up, and that it sort of connects. And he will reach out to me to get more follow-up. So
that's
to me,
great.
it's this kind of like cool, somewhat passive way that can become active from time to time, of having a relationship with all of these, people across the Southwest.
Yeah. So let's get into some of these nuts and bolts. So we talked. Oh, this is great. And actually, I'm gonna encourage folks to go over. So we don't have a huge amount of time for questions and answers here, but I am keeping an eye on it, and I'm going to ask you to go there and upvote. Tell us. We're not going to go through all of these. I don't think we have another 15 minutes or so. Another 10 minutes. So let us know what questions you want us to discuss. But let's talk a little bit somewhere in here. I know, it's just about this workflow. So you mentioned that, if I'm getting the names right, Ben is the producer.
Yep, that's
you
right.
And Zach, and I misspoke earlier. I was thinking
no
it was
worries.
you and Ben,
No worries.
but you two are the talent, and appear on air. Can you give us just a quick rundown of how you do it? I mean, do you extract the audio from Zoom? Have you bought $1,000 studio setup? Is it just a base? Just walk us through in a minute or two, Mike, how you put it together.
Yeah, and this is where I'm trying to understand what Ben does. And so Ben, in knowing enough, so we've done it several different ways over the years, but pre-COVID, we would get together with a couple of fairly cheap but good microphones that were plugged right into to Ben's laptop, and Ben would record it, I think, through something like GarageBand, or some kind of just good high quality recording there. And he would go through and clean up the audio and edit it, and then he pushes it out to the different streaming services. And since COVID, we did mess around with a couple of recording, kind of local recording merge services early on, and Ben just thought it wasn't worth the trouble. So we now literally just have a Zoom meeting that lasts a couple hours, and that he goes back in and does the same thing, cleans up the audio. And
so he just extracts the audio from Zoom. You're not doing like your own separate recording at home and then sharing that, huh?
No,
because the audio is quite good. I mentioned to you earlier today, I thought you must be doing local recordings, because Zoom does some audio compression,
right?
Reduces quality. But you two, Zach sounded a little bit more muffled to me, maybe, and maybe that's just his mic or his setup or whatever. It's mic.
We've talked about it forever, and so it's funny because I when at the beginning of the pandemic, I bought like a $40 Amazon boom mic. My kids thought I was a YouTuber. At that point, they were pretty excited until they realized what I was actually doing with it, and then they were not impressed with it. But so we just literally do a Zoom meeting and try to do it through good microphones, and then Ben monitors, and then we just save it, and then he does. I think he does some things with the audio, through some software. because he's quite talented with that. And he also takes out all the ums, which is just like, oh my gosh, he makes it sound so much better.
So I was surprised at this. So I am a person who's a little bit more technically adept than some people, but I'm not an IT person or anything like that. I found it surprisingly easy to pull out the ums and ahs.
Yeah.
It definitely takes time, but I use
Yeah.
a service called Audacity, which is free, very basic. And yeah, I remove the ums and ahs, and it's doable. Yeah, you're right. There are a couple of services that you get like 5 hours a month free, and then you have to start paying. That'll clean up the audio. All right, so let's go through maybe kind of rapid fire. Mike, a couple of questions here from Slido that folks listening have submitted. What's your number one lesson learned from doing a podcast? Can you reduce it to one?
Yeah, you know what? One of the things that we continue to struggle with is that we do this, we get together an hour before the podcast and we hash out an outline and then we start talking. We have some of the best discussions ahead of that.
Yeah.
And then we try to go into this sort of like, scripted beginning and end, and then it just kind of falls apart. And so Ben has always coached us. He's like, guys, I'll just start talking and, just relax, just start talking. The best stuff's going to come out then, rather than, really starting to like get your brain all in a swirl about what that point you were going to do is. And I do think that that's when we're at our best, is that we're relaxed, we're prepared enough that we know what we're going to talk about, and it's data driven and we understand what's going on. But then it becomes more interesting. It's usually when we start to like make sure that we're like, oh, I got to say that one thing, and then he says it this way and I say it that way, that Ben ends up throwing it out because it doesn't work.
All right, so next kind of rapid fire. What recommendation do you have for someone to get a podcast started? And we know logic model, so you're not going to mention that, but that's assumed.
It's a good idea.
Yeah.
It seems like the barrier, there seems to be almost no barrier to doing it, right? I think it's finding something you're passionate and interested about. I think I'm not the type of person who could do it by myself. I need to be able to talk with somebody. So I think if you get a good guest that you're really interested in talking with, or you can find a partner that you're going to have a good conversation with, that seems to be it. Start recording it.
Yeah.
And maybe just sort of push it out there and see what happens. And I think don't be afraid to change over time, to let it evolve based on some, feedback from some people that you trust and who might be interested in what you have to say.
Yeah. I'm going to take a crack at the next one. How much, and I'll mention your answer, you've already addressed this. How much time do you invest on the podcast per week or month or whatever time frame? Your podcast is once a month and you estimated a couple hours a month.
That's it.
That is, in fairness, it would probably be more for most people doing this because you have Ben, who's a professional or close to a professional producer. I found when I was recording 1 hour-long podcast per month, it probably took me 3 hours or so, maybe a little more. Depends on how many ums and ahs and things are in there to be pulled out. And it depends on your standard for audio quality and how many ums and ahs are okay. Maybe they're fine. That you don't want to make it too slickly, perfectly produced. But it's not much. But that does depend again on having some skills and efficiency and processing and publishing, or some support.
Yeah.
And some extension systems have, people who can support this and others don't. We were more or less on our own, but since we stopped, I think they have invested a little bit more centrally.
Yeah.
Mike, this is a great question from Megan K. Has the podcast created other opportunities for your program? You've talked a little about that, but it's connected you to some meteorologists and reporters and others who are interested. Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, it has. It's connecting with other researchers, which has been really cool. I've been able to meet some researchers across the region who actually started listening to the podcast and have reached out to collaborate on research projects, which was that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I think that it has engaged other partners across the group, some nonprofits, other resource managers who kind of tripped across what we were doing. And it's been kind of an entry point both into extension and clemus. So they found that as a way to sort of engage with us on project work, but also sort of just kind of keep an eye on what's going on with the program. So I think it's that, again, that relationship building kind of passively that can turn into active relationships. And I think it's been really good for the clemus program. We're working on a re-proposal for another 5-year cycle. So we can claim this as a tool and a mode, and it has spurred on other RISAs to try this out and to try their own podcasts, and some other podcasts in the region have spun up because they saw what we were doing and wanted to give it a shot as well.
Well, you want to be at the table. It's interesting. I don't know that this is a case of, they say if you're not at the table, you're on the table or whatever, but it's, people are talking and engaging around new media. Podcasting isn't the newest medium now, but it's nice to be out there. It's good to be heard. I think it makes your program, maybe visible is a funny word for audio files, but it makes your program more visible. It's great to hear you saying that. And Mike, last question, I think here, what have you found is the best way to promote your podcast? Do you do much promotion, or how do you do that?
Yeah. We use Twitter, and we use the primary mode was the clemus listserv. So which has probably got 1,000 people over time that's connected with it. So that's been kind of the primary mode. I think it's been word of mouth. And then I think it's been some of the media interactions we've had as well, which have talked about the podcast. And I give a ton of presentations, I'm sure, as all of you do too, across, your states and your regions. And so, I'll always offer that up as, like, hey, if you're really interested in this and you want to listen to some kind of, banter about this, we've got this podcast as well. And I think we picked up a couple of people through that mode as well.
Great. Well, Mike, we're about at the end of our time. It's 12:50 here in Minnesota. This has really been a lot of fun. I want to thank you for doing this. I threw some curveballs at you there at the last minute, and I appreciate it. This was really a fun conversation, and I think, like I said, I appreciate you taking the time. I want to remind listeners.
Maybe we need to do a podcast about podcasting. So.
Maybe we do. This has been fun. Maybe we should give it a try. This is our webinar about podcasting, or maybe let's do a podcast about webinars. So I just want to remind listeners again, this has been brought to you by the Natural Resources Extension Education Foundation, NREF. NREF is a brand new organization. We've been around about a year, and we are in the midst of our 2021 fundraising campaign. So I'm going to put a link into the chat. You don't have to donate, but we would be grateful if you are inclined to do that. The URL is nref.org, and we would appreciate your support. Even if you don't donate, thank you for supporting us by showing up. This is great. We had a lot of good questions, and I appreciate everyone coming and being a part of this. Mike Crimmins from the University of Arizona, again, thanks for your time. Keep it going. I'm enjoying listening to your podcast, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Thanks so much, Eli. It was really fun.
Bye, everybody.